thank you. Clare Short has come on to the Not the Andrew Marr show for the second time, so it can't have been too bad the first time. And we're going to talk about Iraq, 20 years on since the invasion. Thank you for coming on, Clare. This is a pretty horrific story of people dying, in millions of people dying and being affected by an invasion that could have been stopped effectively. I'd just like to, if you don't mind, I'd just like to play a clip from a conference that you attended 10 years after the Iraq war, about and a part of your speech which I had no idea about, and I'd like to hear what you could say about this.
All this is going to come out as a matter of record, and although the wrong that's being done can't be put right, it is important that the truth and the detailed history is brought out and lessons are learned. It's clear to me now that the US project for the new American century, which I think is on our agenda for later in these sessions, was what explains it all. It was, if you read that document now, the arrogance of it, but these were all the neoconservatives grouping together in their think tanks before they took power, surrounding President Bush, Cheney, Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld. Jeb Bush was one of them, you know, the brother of President Bush, and so on. At the end of the Cold War, believing this was a unipolar American moment and that they should arm themselves more and control the whole world and prevent China rising with any power. That's explicitly said within it. And it says in passing, and there were later documents produced saying, of course, getting rid of Saddam Hussein would be, who was an irritant and had defied American policy, would be beneficial, but that wasn't the main point. The main point was it would enable the United States to have military bases on the Gulf and from there to control the Gulf. And it's shocking to me that those things were written beforehand. And I have to say, in the lead up to the invasion, I was not aware of them. And I think there was a failure in our media and indeed academic community to be aware of that kind of published thinking amongst those who surrounded President Bush when he went into power.
I'd just like to say I didn't know that even now. I wasn't aware of this US project for the next century or whatever. Well, can you tell us when you found out about that, and what did you feel when you heard about this? Obviously, there was an agenda for going into Iraq on the US side, on Bush's side.
Yes, I remember asking my private secretary, is there any published material on American thinking on Iraq? This is before the invasion and the vote and so on. And she gave me some very limited stuff. And then after the invasion, after I'd resigned, when I was looking through all sorts of material, there is this, everyone can look it up, project for the new American century, laying out, as described in that clip, how America's going to dominate the post-Cold War world. There's the reference to the rise of China, and we can see what's going on with that now, and how getting rid of Saddam Hussein is desirable because he's so objectionable, but it also enables the US to dominate the Gulf, which of course, out of which comes a lot of the oil that feeds the world, and therefore it's a pinch point and a power point. And so, I don't know, I just think we're supposed to have this enormously competent civil service and Whitehall and the Foreign Office, and here's this crucially important document that no one brings forward. And indeed, not the media, not the academic community. And there was plenty of debate at the time and plenty of people with doubts about the invasion, but not surfacing this crucial document.
I mean, do you think that would have changed the whole picture if that had come out and the media had put it out there?
I think it would have clarified a lot. I mean, I want to say the situation in Iraq for the people of Iraq was dreadful. Saddam Hussein was a dreadful dictator. The sanctions imposed by the UN because of the allegations of weapons of mass destruction, which meant chemical and biological. No one was saying they were nuclear, even though people were misled about that in the run-up to the war, you know, the bomb that might take place over London in 45 seconds or whatever. But And so sanctions were there, and this famous figure from UNICEF that 500,000 Iraqi children may have died, and Madeleine Albright said it was a price worth paying. So the situation wasn't acceptable. It did need some progress to relieve the suffering of the people of Iraq. So the initial approach to say, let's go back to the UN, let's get the weapons inspectors back in, let's keep the world community together, let's handle this. There was nothing wrong with that. But then what happened after that was Hans Blix was chosen as a weapon inspector. He said later in his book and in speeches, he absolutely assumed there were chemical and biological weapons there. In fact, that was a reasonable assumption. Why would Saddam Hussein throw out the weapons inspectors, let his country be subject to these terrible sanctions? Of course, they weren't hurting him and the elite, but really hurting the people if he didn't have anything. So everyone thought there must be something there. Anyway, Blix gets back, starts the inspection, and starts to realize there's nothing there. And he's reporting back to the Security Council on regular, there are dates given. And when he starts to say, I don't think there's anything, which of course should have led to that finding, the lifting of sanctions. It could well have led to Saddam Hussein being indicted for war crimes and an invitation to the people of Iraq to send him to the International Criminal Court, a bit like Milosevic. I mean, there were non-violent ways of helping the people of Iraq, but no, instead, they briefed against Blix, and then they couldn't get the second resolution they promised through the UN, so then they attacked the French as doing something improper. And then it's really clear that they were determined to go to war, and the reasons that had been given about the UN and about WMD were all a subterfuge. And Blair misled all of us about that, because he kept going hard and then going soft and saying it would always be the UN and it would always be the UN. And then when it came to it, he threw all that away and just went with America, come what may, with this dishonest account of what was being done.
So there's an agenda from Bush's team around him to go into Iraq, to get rid of Saddam and to have bases there. Tony Blair is brought in and they say, look, Blair, we need you to back this because, you know, we obviously it would be difficult if the US did it on its own. How do you interpret his going along with them and manipulating cabinet and the civil service and the courts and almost anything he could in order to make this happen? How do you see him do it? What was he doing?
I think we have to face the fact that since the Second World War, British governments have always wanted to stay close to the US. That Britain used to be powerful, now it's the US, and if we can be their best friend, we still remain powerful. I mean, that has been a centerpiece of UK foreign policy since 1945. Famously, Harold Wilson, to his great credit, kept us out of the Vietnam War, even though America put enormous pressure on Britain to join. And again, didn't want British troops. They wanted this sense of a coalition of international support. Similarly, Bush didn't have very much international support at all for the attack on Iraq. So Britain was crucial, not militarily, not financially, not in any way, but just as a symbol of a broad coalition. And it's important to remember that the American public were willing to say in all the polling, yes, if we're in a coalition, we'll support this. Alone, no. So that was Britain's role. And that was the possible leverage for Tony. And my whole thing from the beginning was if we can hold his ankles, he might hold Bush, and we might find a better way of dealing with this suffering of the people of Iraq and the, you know, standoff and the sanctions and all the rest of it. And that's, there was a better outcome that was possible. But no, then the lies came in. America was determined to go, come what may. They chose the date. There was no emergency. Nothing had happened that meant they had to rush. But they chose the date. They didn't prepare. They didn't think through. They believed their own propaganda. They thought the people of Iraq, I mean, of course, Saddam Hussein was unpopular. He was a cruel dictator, but they thought people would give them flowers and let them march in and there wouldn't be any problem, and they didn't have to make any preparations for occupying the country and how to take it forward. And they didn't, and we've seen all the consequences. As well as being wrong, there's massive incompetence. we mustn't. My dad always used to say, don't overestimate the enemy. And in this case, we think the British military are competent. No, we were meant to come in from the north, then the Turks voted against. We came in to the south. They took on Basra. They couldn't control it. They had to run away. At the last minute, my department was saying to them, you realize you'll be an occupying power. You'll have to provide for the people in international law. That's what's required. They started ordering food at the last minute. So the Americans were incompetent, the British were incompetent. It's quite frightening because we think the systems might be wrong, but that they work. But this was just irresponsible to an enormous degree and an enormous cost to Iraq and its people. And indeed, it created ISIS, the whole thing, which further destabilized the whole region and Syria and so on.
The thing that I found shocking was the Attorney General legal advice 3 days before the invasion, a rather lengthy report, I suppose. That is really trying to push things through quickly, and you were shut down apparently when you tried to make any points about this.
Well, yes, and this is very important, and I think there's a lesson here. The Attorney General shouldn't be enabled to be a friend of the Prime Minister who's just appointed. It should be an independent legal advice to the government and Parliament. I think it shows that office is not reliable. But the whisper went round Whitehall that the legal advice said there wasn't authority for war. And you remember Scott, wasn't that her name? She was the deputy legal advisor in the Foreign Office. She resigned.
Right.
So, but then the word was coming out of the Ministry of Defence, they wouldn't go without clear legal authority because that would make British soldiers subject to the International Criminal Court. We'd signed up, the Americans hadn't. So that's a pretty heavy duty thing, and I'm feeling hopeful that this is happening. And then everything goes quiet, and so we're waiting the cabinet for the legal advice. And then there's a special cabinet. Robin doesn't, right towards the end, Robin doesn't attend, he must have gone by then. And the Attorney General comes and sits in his seat and puts down 2 sides of A4, that's all. And he starts reading it. And I say, you don't need to read it, we can read, but tell us what happened. Have you changed your mind? What is this? And they all said, no, Claire, stop it. I mean, everything was very fraught by then. And what this was a parliamentary answer to a question in the House of Lords summarising the legal advice. It wasn't the legal advice. And then much later, after the war, the full legal advice came out, and it's available.
Oh, right.
Everyone can read it. And it says that there were doubts about the war, and then it says, but if the Prime Minister would give an undertaking that, I can't remember what now, that there's no other way of doing something, then it might be legal. So he gave this side undertaking. You can see the thing has been manipulated to kind of turn things around and somehow get... And I think it's required that the legal advice should be circulated to the Cabinet. It wasn't. We were misled. We weren't allowed to discuss it, why it came at the very last minute. So there's no doubt the legal advice was manipulated. And the promise to comply with international law was also broken. And all this is on, people can see the full legal advice now and exactly what happened.
And then when Robin Cook resigned, you were thinking of resigning as well, but Tony Blair promised you certain things in order to stop you doing that. Can you tell us about that?
Well, yes, you book, if you want to make a resignation speech, you book with the speaker, a slot. And when I did so, the speaker said, oh no, Robin's there already, which I didn't know. I knew he was thinking of going, but then Blair asked to see me, puts on all his charm, says, I'd hate to lose you, blah, blah, blah. Is there anything that would persuade you not to go? And I said, you've gone so far, we can't stop the invasion. But if there is no occupation, and if the United Nations could lead the reconstruction and have international troops and not have, I think the people of Iraq might come through all right. He said, well, I can do that. No problem. I can do that. I'm seeing Bush is coming to Northern Ireland in the next few days. I'll get that promise. And I believed him. I mean, it would have made a phenomenal difference, an absolutely phenomenal difference. And he actually, if you look at the outcome of that conference in Northern Ireland, Bush says United Nations about 6 times, and the Americans aren't keen on the UN at all, and certainly weren't in that administration. So that's what Tony got, 6 mentions of the UN, but no such thing as the United Nations leading the reconstruction. It was a full-blooded occupation under international law. So I was duped, and I got a lot of stick for it. And in my heart of hearts, I don't regret it. I regret believing him, but I think it was the right judgment. If that could have been achieved, it would have made a phenomenal difference.
And I can understand your thinking that if you can pull Blair back, then he can pull Bush back. I can see if you weren't there at all, then it might have not been at all possible to influence Blair. So it's totally understandable that you would stay and try to hold him to account.
But then the promise was reached, and then there was nothing I could do, and I had to go. Yeah. Later.
I mean, can I just ask you another thing that I've just thought about, which is that there are lots of people who think that David Kelly was bumped off. Some people think Robin Cook was bumped off. That those don't seem to be going away as people, as conspiracies, I suppose, about what happened. But you can understand why people would think that, because of the dishonesty of what happened before that, can't you? I mean, in a way, the way that Tony Blair operated has undermined
trust
in politicians and what they do, and whether there's dark stuff going on in the background. Do you think that he's responsible for that, and in a way he should come out and actually make it clear that he should have been more honest?
Well, I don't think for a minute that Robin was bumped off. I mean, he climbed a mountain and had a heart attack. I think they did a post-mortem, Kelly was much more believable because it was extraordinary what happened to him. But there was a big inquiry, and so I believed, and his family believed.
I mean, you weren't at any point worried that you were going to be bumped off, were you?
No, I can't say. I had enough, I was worried about enough things. No, I didn't worry about that. But Kelly was pushed to extreme by Alistair Campbell and to go before the select committee, and he was under terrible stress. I mean, that probably affected his health and his mental health. And if you remember, because this is Gary Lineker, you remember Gilligan made this little comment in the 6 o'clock news in the Today programme that Kelly had said they were, I can't remember the exact words, but they were misrepresenting the stuff on WMD, which he did say and was fundamentally true. The wording might have been a little bit clumsy. And Campbell, now such a defender of Lineker, and Blair, and that made such a big fuss, it caused the chair of the BBC had to resign and Gilligan had to be sacked. That was Greg Dyke. I mean, I'm just, right. Do you remember all that? Well, I mean, yeah. It depends how old one is. But so then the Gary Lineker thing is much less serious than what Labour did to the BBC because of the Gilligan comment on the Kelly affair.
Yeah, it's true. If it's your argument that's holding sway in the BBC, then you're quite happy with it. It sounds like to me.
Well, I mean, but forcing the Director General to resign.
Yeah.
I mean, this was just Gary Lineker being taken off air for a week. Well, what's the difference? Anyway.
So this trust, but the fact that
your question was about trust. I think the demonstration on the 15th of February is so enormous and powerful, and there were studies saying 1 in 10 of the people in the country knew someone on the demonstration. It was enormous. I think most people who went on that thought they could, the government would have to listen. This was the country speaking. People were moved by going and the numbers of people. My son went with his church and my granddaughters who were little at the time. And he sent me a text saying, Blair's got to listen to this. It's so powerful. It's so overwhelming. It's so fine. So I think after all that, trust in politics was massively reduced in general. I mean, you got a reduction. I mean, when Blair went on to win another election, but massive reduction in the vote. But I think, there's very, very low trust in politics in Britain now, and that is part of it. I
mean, I want to ask you, there is this feeling of let's just move on, let's get, what's the point in talking about this thing 20 years ago? There's other things to do. We just got to, but why do you think it's important that the history of what happened, the facts of what happened, comes out? What do you think also about the Chilcot inquiry? I mean, do you think that's resolved that? Do you think
I think the trouble with Chilcot, they sent me what is it, 16 volumes? I mean, historians will use it, but it's so carefully phrased and such a, massive piece. It didn't kind of bring the country to know what had happened and what the lessons were. I think America must have its own reckoning, and it's got plenty of problems about, its attempts to dominate the world, etc. But for us, there are real issues about our constitutional arrangements, the role of the Attorney General, the manipulation of a legal opinion that should have been objective and so on. And also the core of our foreign policy. If you look at all the foreign policy think tanks and the current thinking of both main parties, being close to America is the core thinking. And I really think this we need to debate. It's hardly debated. I think Britain could be a really honourable and useful country as a middle-ranking power with historical relationships across the world. We used to be a really leading quality player in development. I think we should get that back. And then we should try to have a world that's more sustainably managed, that complies with international law, and make coalitions that are willing to try and, get some progress on Israel-Palestine, for example. We could be like a Scandinavian country, but a bigger country with a strong military, and the military could serve UN peacekeeping. And that, people might not agree with me, but we can't even discuss this. This is, and then we'd all be proud of what Britain could do in the world. Wouldn't that be good?